So I don't know. I don't know what you do when you're sitting on vulnerabilities for 9 months to a year, and actually my company's in that situation right now. I actually love this. Might be a great point to ask other people in the audience about. What do you do when you're sitting on, say, 30+ advisories across 10+ vendors with remote command execution vulnerabilities that affect tens of thousands of hosts inside of every enterprise, and we just want to see the problems fixed more than anything, and we have zero leverage, right? And maybe also it's a question for vendors. What are the incentives to fix it if the rules of the game are you don't disclose unless there's a patch?
I mean, if you're really looking out, so to speak, for the common good, and you're not getting progress with the vendor, I would hope. I think we've been effective at US CERT in helping to apply pressure to the vendors to move them along. We always caveat that too. Under what we call responsible disclosure. If there is a active exploitation stuff, then we're going to be communicating a little bit faster than what we normally would. But I think the key thing there is that the vendors do need to kind of own that problem. And I think it might be a good segue into the third-party fix discussion as well. When researchers come up with the capability, if there is a time gap and the vendor's not responsive, and we've seen historically instances of that where the researcher or another group comes up with a third-party fix, do organizations go about applying that? Again, I think it'd be a good discussion for some of the end users here.
Yeah, and I think, just to comment on my own question, that I think fortunately it's in this day and age, it's a very rare circumstance when that occurs now. Things have changed a lot in the last 5 years, and so vendors do typically take security issues quite seriously. My perspective on that is that it would be a very rare situation when you should proceed with disclosure, but that can occur that a vendor simply will not produce a patch. They've told you that they won't. And so to answer that question, I put myself in the end user's shoes. What would I want? It's never a desirable situation when a vulnerability goes out without a patch, but as an end user, there comes a point when I have a right to know about it, even if there's not a patch, even if it's because I want to know that that vendor doesn't take security seriously and I need to find another vendor. But I think from a researcher standpoint, you have to go to great lengths before you would ever reach that point.
And actually, on that note, I have a question for our panel or audience members who have an opinion on this. We talked earlier this morning about how the top 10 ISVs are actually pretty good at doing security these days, but I'm curious how you're managing those other ISVs who you have in your environments that may be just as pervasive as the top 10 ISVs, and how do you push them or leverage them to being more proactive about security?
I think we had a comment at the back. Giant green shirt.
It's gonna.
Is anybody on the panel in favor of full disclosure?
Define that.
Yeah,
Well,
define full disclosure.
We don't even agree on what full disclosure actually is.
That's the issue.
Like, you mean just once you find a vulnerability, release full details without going to the vendor?
Define the problem and you make it known.
Huh. So we discussed this morning at 7 a.m. when they made us get up for our panel discussion before we got here. So we're probably not as sharp.
And I'll point out you were late.
He's such a girl, God, why do I bother?
It's true, I have better hair than you too.
Sorry. So I think for me, anyway, as a user per se, in an enterprise solution, it is what is the vulnerability that we're looking at? Is it massive? If it's massive, then yeah, I think we need to know. If it's baby candy, don't bother me with it because it's not something that I need to be woken up for in the middle of the night. But then there's this other side. If it's a massive exploit or vulnerability that's pending that we don't know about in the world or publicly, whatever, and the majority of industries or private users or end users are using this particular software or this service, then in fact, we need to know. It could be a pandemic situation, of course, but we're all in the same boat at that point, right? So whether the good guys know where the bad guys go, it's kind of like Y2K. The banks are closed, nobody gets money. So it doesn't matter if it's under your mattress or not. So I'm kind of in that boat there. If it's that big, then we do need to know. Because everyone's going to know anyway, and we're all in the same situation. So how much worse could it really get?
Yeah, I think most of the research that I do is on backbone security and backbone vulnerabilities. And so if I were to just, take whatever I did and throw it out on full disclosure without going to the vendor and being nice with them, then, my internet breaks. I'm not real happy about that. So because of the nature of the area of my research, I do my best to work with the vendors when at all possible. I mean, other than that, if I have to, but I devoutly hope to never get to that point again.
We have a comment over here. Yeah, one comment I want to point out Pam does look at it from an end user perspective. So we're not talking about vendors going, that's not important. I mean, just to clarify that.
Exactly, right.
So the end user doesn't analyze it properly. It doesn't really matter. I mean, who's to really say the severity of the vulnerability at that point?
And that's another issue that we talked about this morning too. What level of severity are we talking about when we're talking full disclosure? So when I say the little stuff, that which exists but is not that pandemic that cannot cause such great havoc, if you will. So an exploit that's found, just like we used to see on Bug Track, you were talking about, those were the fun days. Everything was posted, choose it if you want, don't play with it if you don't want to. And the reality of it is, if any of you subscribed to Bug Track back then, it was constant all day long, right? That's not what I'm talking about. Don't bother me with that type of stuff. It's the high end that could disrupt service. Nationwide, internationally, kind of like SCADA could go down, that which could, impact life even. So it's not just about businesses operating, it's about utilities, it's about getting my money from the bank. So that's a situation that I think that we would need full disclosure for in order to control chaos and aftermath, if you will.
Okay, and the one question real quick for the vendors, as you're sitting on these vulnerabilities working on a patch, are any of you under any illusion that the person that reported it is the only one with that information?
We actually talked about that this morning. So we had
talked a lot this morning, didn't we?
for 7 a.m. We had a working assumption that if one person knows something, 2 people will. And so then it's a matter of attempting for as best as is humanly possible to monitor the situation as it develops to determine if in fact more than 2 people know or a customer or a situation is affected so that we can see something that isn't truly exploitable. In fact, one of the points that Jerry just made about US CERT is because they might actually be the first one to hear about a situation being exploited. Typically, obviously now it's known. One of the relationship areas that they've built quite a bit is with particular vendors to ensure that if they hear it as opposed to us, another source of information can inject it into our thinking, which says, you might not have heard, but now you need to know. It's no longer, quote unquote, a secret.
That's the key thing. I mean, if you do full disclosure, sort of Bug Track style on some truly apocalyptic vulnerability, then the cure may be worse than the disease in the sense that you get this thing out there and script kiddies start exploiting it and so on. At the same time, you don't want to delude yourself that only you and the original finder know something when that's not the case. And so, I mean, one of the things we've done last year, 2 years, put a lot of investment and effort into situational awareness. Basically, what's out there, what's happening on the net, what are people we know seeing? Is our assumption that this is a private report correct? Can't be perfect, but it's something you really have to put resources into.
This is probably a good segue into our second topic. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
What's interesting in several years of bug hunting and probably several hundred vulnerability reports to various vendors, in terms of them turning around and saying this was reported last week by another person, that's probably happened about 10 or 15 times. What I'd like to know is from like the vendor side is when a report comes into someone like Microsoft, for example, whether they have any data on that it's been reported by 3 or 4 separate people kind of thing. Based upon my experiences, I would guess that with a couple of minor exceptions, that the vast majority will be a single person reporting the flaw. But whether that has any relevancy on the actual working situation that we need to work to, i.e. if one person knows, let's assume 2 or more people know, whether that has any relevance on that is, well, I think is irrelevant, but in terms of is there an indicator, is there a pointer towards actual data on this? In my experience, most of the stuff I report, I'm the only one who's reported it kind of thing. And I think the vendor data might lend itself to backing that up, potentially, I don't know. Well, we're talking about pre-disclosure here. Post-disclosure, it's people will begin using it. Correct. That's what I'm saying. It bears no relevancy on this situation whatsoever, other than, in my experience, everything I report, only occasionally does someone else report the same thing. Correct. You're absolutely right. I don't dispute that. There could be the underground using it as well. The only data I can work with, though, is the data I have at hand, and that's what I have at hand, you know? But by that stage, it's too late to make any accurate determination, because as soon as it's in the public, but then that's pre-disclosure.
This goes straight to what he said. He said that they may consider upping the release time or working harder on a specific issue if there's evidence of exploitation. He's asking, how do we know there's evidence of exploitation without knowing about the vulnerability? It's a big catch-22.
Correct, but that's what I'm saying. And until such time that you do know, there's stuff all you can do about it, really.
No,
so,
I mean,
that's the difficulty, I think. You know.
I mean, people find evidence of vulnerabilities and vulnerabilities being exploited without a priori knowledge of what the vulnerability is. I mean, you know, users still find anomalies. They may not say, you know, this is a vulnerability in XYZ.dll, but they find things unusual happening. They report them to us, or, you know, to law enforcement, who brings them to us, or what have you, on that basis, and then we're able to do the investigation and figure out what's really going on. I didn't.
So you only know the issues where it's been reported to you. If somebody took over a machine and actually did nothing about it on that machine, they just sat with an account on there for 2 years or whatever, you're not going to know.
But there's nothing to disclose if they don't know.
Right, what's your point? I'm trying to figure out what the point is in that. If you don't know, you don't know.
Well, they're not told us. There's a vulnerability that they're sitting on that they've not told us about, so we can't actually look for evidence that that vulnerability has been exposed.
Well, you can't actually have a disclosure issue until you've got something to disclose. So if somebody knows something,
No,
the vendor knows.
Right. Well, it's that window when the vendor knows and believes that they and the individual researcher who has perhaps kept it quiet know the period between that and when they start putting things out while they're working on patches. And certainly if that period extends to 9 months or years or whatever, that's a little bit ridiculous. But from the vendor perspective, it really is a question of, as best you can, you're trying to do a risk assessment on, is it likely to be quiet enough that it's better for customers to keep it quiet while I work on it and make the announcement when the patches are available, or tell the whole world about it, and by so doing, giving a pretty good indication of where the problem is and perhaps making it worse. It really is a risk assessment, and the best I think vendors can do at this point, and certainly you can discuss the possibility that maybe you ought to just announce it as soon as you know, even if there is no workaround and nothing to do, and figure that everyone was insecure anyway, you might as well make them publicly insecure, versus is it worthwhile to keep it quiet and hope?
Well, moderator's prerogative to jump to topic 6, because you guys are running right in the middle of it. Let me just bring it up and let the panelists comment on this. What happens, because the